Here we're looking at Mount Vesuvius, and the bumps on the left of the main cone are actually the residuum of a much larger structure which was called Mount Somma, which was blasted apart in a very large eruption in AD 79. And we're looking at the modern town of Portici, which is one of the most densely populated places in Europe. So the caldera just above it was blasted to pieces in classical times, and the cone next to that, or in the center of the caldera, the former caldera, was active on a fairly constant basis from AD 1631 until the last stages of the Second World War. And the trouble with Portici, which has a population density of 18,000 people per square kilometre, is that it is right in the way of potential pyroclastic flows, which are very hot, directed flows of steam, ash, gas, and solid material, possibly at about 650 degrees centigrade or more, that would roll down the mountain, and they will carbonize or vaporize any organic material that they come into contact with. And in fact, in 1631, that is exactly what happened to Portici, wiping out the entire population, which was then 4,000 people. A rather accurate, rather remarkable painting of that was made at the time, which shows this scene from the outskirts of Naples, a suburb called San Giovanni in Teduccio. And you can see the steam and the clouds from the pyroclastic flow rolling towards Portici, where they would eventually destroy it in a very few minutes. A modern analogy comes from Montserrat in the Caribbean. Fortunately, no one was in the way of that, but scientists in a helicopter managed to photograph a pyroclastic flow underway. It meets the sea, and the sea boils as the hot material comes down the mountain and lands in the water. And that indeed is what could occur. In fact, in the whole of the Vesuvian area, vulnerability is extraordinarily high to a volcanic eruption, with as many as 3 million people at risk, and certainly 750,000 on the flanks of the volcano itself in the 17 municipalities that comprise that area. And when we look at that, you can see in the distance in this picture high densities of human habitation, houses, buildings, roads. And in the foreground, you can see lava flows that are not that ancient by geological terms, 19th century, most of them. So when Vesuvius reactivates, there will definitely be problems of containing damage and evacuating people. In fact, it has been suggested that the evacuation time might take as long as 11 days to evacuate everyone, but the warning time might be as short as 4 days. And moreover, it's possible that ashfall will cause as many as 17,000 roofs to collapse because of the weight of ash accumulating on them. So there is very high vulnerability in the circum-Vesuvian area. We're looking here at a town afflicted by intra-urban seismic landsliding. So an earthquake-triggered landslide here has taken the centre out of the town. It did so three days after a large earthquake, so it wasn't coterminous. It didn't occur exactly at the same time, but it certainly was a product of the earthquake, and it swept away houses, roads, and water supplies, and so on and so forth. Here's another seismic landslide that destroyed 11 kilometres of road leading to a rather isolated town, and therefore temporary adjustments had to be made to the road surface in order for emergency vehicles to pass. And that really was problematic also for some farmhouses affected. Liquefaction was the problem, which is very common and a strong source of vulnerability in many places, where the ground spontaneously goes from a solid behaviour to a liquid one when earthquake shaking begins. Perhaps the worst affected area in the world is the prefecture of Niigata in western Japan. We're looking here at some landslide effects. They're both in roughly the same area, but they are separated by several centuries. On one side, we see ancient rotational slumping that occurred in 1777. The building was left as it was. The floors and windows were put upright in it. It was still used despite the inclination of it, rather surprisingly, and a modern building of reinforced concrete that was put out of true by 6 degrees. It leans 6 degrees in 1982, and since then, of course, it has been demolished. So when landslides occur in urban areas, there are many urban areas of the world that have considerable vulnerability to this, and the damage can be quite strong. There is a slumping feature. It extends through the house on the right-hand side of the picture there, and has caused the house to shear off its foundations, fortunately without collapsing, but of course the whole thing then has to be demolished. In this instance, the landslide has powered into the house, partially demolishing it, and the rest will either be naturally demolished by further landslide movement, or more likely the fire brigade will bring it down so that it no longer constitutes a hazard. This was a hospital, and unfortunately, although it was fairly well built, it suffered landsliding under the foundations, which, despite it being a fairly integral reinforced concrete structure, meant that the forward thrust was so great that it pushed out of true above all the nodes between columns and beams, and therefore rendered the entire structure inoperable, and it had to be evacuated at 3 o'clock in the morning. And one patient who was on life support didn't survive that, unfortunately, but it had to be done for fear that the entire building would collapse during the night spontaneously. The effect of landsliding: a great forward thrust, seriously damaging, compromising the building. Here's a much older building which has got a landslide headscarp running through it, and that has gradually torn the building apart with an extensional movement. As to the right of the picture, the land has gone in the downward direction, slowly, but pulling apart the headscarp. And since I took the picture on the right, the little spyglass, which is the piece of glass cemented across the crack there, has smashed. In other words, the crack has opened further. Well, here we have a landslide headscarp right in the middle of town. It's destroyed some buildings, but others are still left. It has been gunnited, in other words, stabilized by pouring concrete on it, liquid concrete, which then sets, and also a retaining wall. But it is certainly the fruit of a major landslide movement within the town, changing the shape and the nature of the town, and we could call that a sort of human ecology of the adaptation to landslide vulnerability, or the adaptation of vulnerability to landslide hazard. In this instance, there was a spontaneous movement at night, and this in fact was an urban area. It doesn't look like one, but what happened there was that a house with 4 people in it collapsed, and they all died. And you're looking there at the site of their bedroom. You can see some bits of bedroom furniture, but in a matter of seconds the entire building simply collapsed as a result of instability under the foundations. So that was an area of very high vulnerability to landslide movement, and the effects look like this. Translational movement: the spontaneous total failure of foundations by downslope movement of the whole building, causing it to collapse completely. In this instance, we're looking at what's known as a Sackung. We use the German terminology for a sagging sort of process with large-scale gravitational displacement, which here is shown in a nice rural area where it doesn't seem very harmful or anything. But when we look downslope, it goes right through a town, right through the middle of town, pulling apart buildings left, right and centre, which is distinctly problematic because it's a chronic problem that goes on and on. It isn't simply cured by a few remedial measures. Here we're looking at a town which has intra-urban landsliding. It has some nice historic elements, but right in the middle of it is a rather landslide-prone area where buildings have been torn apart or torn down by slope movements. A great deal of stabilisation work has gone on there. However, the whole town remains susceptible to landslides. It is very vulnerable to landslide movement. Here we're in the Alps, we're in a rural area, but at the bottom of the slope there is a complex of 2 or 3 new hotels, and unfortunately just above them is a debris flow which is moving down towards the hotels, so that really wasn't a very good place to put them. When they decided they would build there, they clearly did not look adequately into the hazardousness of the site, and therefore they created vulnerability by building new structures on somewhere where they shouldn't have been built at all. Here we're in Colombia, and we're looking at a site where there is a hacienda. You can see some of the buildings of it in the foreground, but behind that they've decided to cut down the forest for some reason. That was distinctly unwise, because what they've done is created an unstable area of land that very easily could collapse straight onto the house, because there are no longer the root structures and the forest to defend it against slope movement. Slope movement does occur, and here is an attempt to reduce it by putting up barriers. This is in the Alps again. Unfortunately, a rock has gone straight through the barriers, although they have managed to stop a slightly smaller rock, and the picture was taken from the road underneath, which remains vulnerable to these things. Having nearly been wiped out by one of these rock falls, I can tell you it is definitely a problem.